Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at Second Baptist. I'm glad you could be with me today. We are continuing on in our study of Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes. And today we're going to find ourselves in chapter 3. Last week we talked about, or Solomon was talking about different things that were all is vanity. That's kind of a theme through the book until we get to the end. And so he was talking about he had tried pleasures and possessions, and all of that was vanity. And then he talked about labor and someone working for to get as much accumulation of possessions as they could, and then giving that to someone who is not going to appreciate it when they die. And so that was kind of one of the last parts of the chapter last week. And so today we're going to talk about he gets onto the subject of time, and this is one of the more famous quoted scriptures in the Bible for weddings and different things like that that we're going to study through today. And of course, all of us have the same amount of time in a day, and we live in such a hectic society in many ways that we don't want people to waste our time. And we have a lot of things that come at us during the day that are time wasters. Telemarketers calling and trying to get your money over the phone. They're wasting your time, when they do that. And perhaps you have a person who calls on the phone and won't ever get to the end of the conversation, and you may feel like that person is wasting some of your time, or that they could have said what they said in fewer words. We don't want to have appointments that are broken, or we have to wait on people. There's so many things during the day that we would consider time wasters. And so Solomon also, I'm sure, had 24 hours in each of his days. And he probably had some time wasters that were trying to do the same thing to him in different ways. Maybe it wasn't telemarketers, because obviously he didn't have a phone, but there would have been those people who showed up, trying to sell snake oil or whatever, that were wasting his time. So he begins to consider time and the purpose of it and the different aspects of it. So let's go ahead and jump into these verses. And so he starts off in chapter 3 now, is where we are. Verse 1, he starts off by saying, "There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven." So time is a part of every occasion, isn't it? Everything that happens in our lives, time is an integral part of that, in how long it takes and what time of life it happens. All of those things, are tied up in time. And so then he begins this poetic list of contrasts, talking about time. And so I'm going to read the next 3 verses, 2 to 4. A time, so he says, there's a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. So we'll kind of, look at each one of those. So a time at the beginning, he starts off with birth and death, which those are the most, I guess, important times in our lives, if you could put it that way. When are we born and when do we die? And then everything else comes in between that, doesn't it? So those two are obviously first. We have a time that God has fixed for us to be born, and we have a time that God has fixed for us to die. And it says that in one of the Psalms, where it says every day that was going to be, one of our days was already known to God before even one of them ever came to pass. So God has a fixed expiration date on us, is what I like to say. And, we have some input into that. Sometimes we can, when someone is such a heavy drinker that a person says they died before their time, you hear that. And so the implication is that by their actions, they cut their life short before the time that God had set for them. And you would have a contrasting group of people that would say, if God intended that person to live longer, he would have been able to do that. And, that is true. Against all odds, God could make you live to a certain day, and he has the power to do that. But I think we do have our free will gets involved with it, and we do influence it, maybe in a way that God would not want it to be that way, but it is. And so that brings in the idea of stewardship of time. Stewardship of the time that God has given us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, let's go to the next one. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. You could make comparisons to planting of not only crops, but, other things that may be started or then stopped. It's that course has finished. It's not something that we need to go back to. It needs to end, that kind of thing. And so it can not only just be agricultural, a time to kill and a time to heal. And we could talk deeply about each one of these points, but we won't in the interest of time, whether it's talking about war and then healing as in doctors, or whether it's talking about killing of maybe, an animal for food, killing a person because of crime or whatever. There's a whole lot of discussions that we could drag out on that point. A time to tear down and a time to build up. And that, again, I think these are not only literal meanings, of building and tearing down, but also you can take them further into the interaction between human beings. A time to weep and a time to laugh. That one's kind of obvious. A time to mourn and a time to dance. And part of that has to do with being appropriate also. You don't want to be laughing when it's a time to mourn. You want to be appropriate. And you also don't want to be laughing when everyone else is weeping, because that would not be appropriate. And so these all affect the interactions that we have as the humans with each other. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. That one, stoning people back in those days, was a punishment that they did sometimes. It was usually for sins of adultery and other things like that, where the person would be stoned. And so, again, those are human interactions. The book speculated on several other meanings for that. I'm going on now to verse 5. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. And again, our human interactions with each other. And when is it the time for embracing, and when is it the time to shun the embracing? And you could get into tough love and all sorts of things with that, I guess. All of these have a deeper meaning, I think. Okay, now let me be sure that I've not skipped anything, and we'll keep going. Yeah, we're just going to go right along. So in verse 6, a time to search and a time to give up as lost. So obviously, if you have lost something of value, you would search and search and search. But then there does come a point where you have to say, okay, the searching needs to stop, and we have to move on with life. And we see that with, sometimes when someone gets lost in the ocean, and they search and search and search, and then finally they give up the search. And, the person whose loved one was lost in the ocean doesn't feel any less concerned for that person. They want to still find them. But they could not, even if they searched every day for the rest of their lives, that person may not be found. And I think that's, we have to be realistic at times to say, okay, the search is going to end. And for whatever thing that it applies to. And a time to give something up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. Boy, we could all take a lesson from that verse, couldn't we? Because we tend to keep and keep and keep and keep and never clean out that closet or that wardrobe or whatever it is. We just keep more, and we get a bigger house so that we can keep even more. When in fact, God expects us to live a simpler life where we do keep things sometimes, but then there's time also to just throw away or get rid of. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. And again, this one is not only physical, but also interactions with other humans, where we might tear ourselves away from a situation, and then there might be another time where we knit ourselves very closely together with another group of people. And sometimes that happens. A time to be silent and a time to speak. Definitely, I think that one is very obvious. And being appropriate, and also just being fair to other people so that you don't dominate the conversation and you allow the other person time for for them to speak, and then you have your time to speak. Those are all very important. That has to do with wasting someone else's time, doesn't it? A time to love and a time to hate. And, we try not to ever say that we hate another person, because I don't really think that that's what this is talking about. But we do hate the actions of other people sometimes. And, then there's a time that we must love others, even though we may not feel like it. And, all of those human interactions of love and hate are a part of our lives and a choice that we make daily. And then the last one, a time for war and a time for peace. And, unfortunately, that is the way of the world. And it was in Solomon's day, and it still is now, and it always will be until Jesus comes back and the kingdom of heaven is established on earth. And until that time, there's always going to be times of war, and hopefully also times of peace when there's not a war. But we do need to work toward having peace as much as possible. But, the Bible never promised us that we would have peace on earth, in that sense of nobody fighting anybody, because this gets into human nature and the way that people interact with each other, especially if they're not believers in Jesus. They don't have the Spirit to guide them to know that there may be another way to solve an issue besides fighting. And so we get that. And so now we're down to verse 9. And in 9 and 10, I'll read those two together. Well, actually, they've got 9, 10, and 11 together, so I'll read those three. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men, with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. So some of these questions that he's asking here is what I'd call a rhetorical question. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? Well, he's not really expecting an answer per se, but he's just, making a statement that, is there a profit to working hard every day? Well, sure there is. You get food, you buy your groceries, right? You take care of yourself. You take care of your home. Whatever the hard work is that you've done, there is a profit to it in that sense. He says, I've seen the task which God has given to the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. So he's been observing all kinds of work that God has given men to do. And he's, viewed this with the aspect of time, that we have a certain amount of time and God has given us tasks to do to gain our livelihood, or also things that God wants us to do. That's a whole other aspect of this. And then in verse 11, he said, he, meaning God, has made everything appropriate in its time, or some versions say beautiful in its time. So his observation is that there is a time for all of these activities and a reason for those to happen at certain times. And then he says that God has also set eternity in the hearts of men, but not in a way that men could find out the work which God has done from the beginning. Or from the beginning even to the end. And so this is also Solomon's observation on it, that God has put eternity into our hearts so that we can understand eternity. We can grasp that there is such a thing as eternity. But yet, God has not given us the full picture in such a way that we could know and understand fully what God is doing from the beginning to the end, all the things that God is doing and why. Because there are a lot of things that happen in life and we just don't quite understand why God did it the way he did it. That happens to all of us, and we wish that, as Christians, if we accept Christ, then everything would just be rosy after that. I mean, that would be wonderful, but would it be wonderful? Would you have people becoming Christians because they felt that they could get something out of it? Would we be strong as people if we were never tested or never went through trials? There's a whole lot of reasons why everything being rosy all the time might not be a good idea for us. And so God has given us this idea of eternity, but yet he doesn't give us the full picture, and we realize that. And that's where we have to just trust God, that he's God and we're not. We get that confused sometimes, or it's easy to get that confused. We would like to tell God what we want him to do, but really and truly, if God had, given us all the things we asked for in our lives, it probably would not have been in our best interest. And so we have to always remember that God is God and we're not, and he has a bigger picture in mind than we can possibly understand. And so he goes on then in 12 and 13 to say, I know there is nothing better for them, meaning men, than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. Okay, so here he's telling us that God's gift to us is the ability to work and to eat and drink and enjoy the fruits of our labor. That is one of God's gifts to us. And really, if we would consider it that way, that God is giving us a gift to be able to work, and a gift then to be able to enjoy the things that we have worked for, then there might be a lot less complaining from people about the job they have, or the circumstance, that they find themselves in at work and things like that, because truly, God could take it all away in an instant. He could make it so that you could not work or have a job or have money or have income, God is in control, and if we would look at the things that he's given us to do as a gift, that would really help to make things better. And then let's read verses 14 and 15. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. And in your book it says, God, it says something completely different. God seeks justice for the persecuted. I don't know how they got that from to be so different than my version, but anyway, we won't go into how that could have happened. But what he does, he's making a statement here now in 14 that everything God does will remain forever. So the works or the acts of God, the times that are fixed by God for certain things or whatever, those will remain forever. Those are permanent. Those are, there are some things in the world that are not negotiable. There are forces in the world that God has put into action forces of nature or whatever that are not negotiable for us as humans. And, you could even go into a discussion about pollution and destroying the environment, from that point, that God has put the earth in motion and these forces of nature in motion, and He has a desire for them to work in a certain way. And when we as humans go and pollute or mess up the creation of God, killing animals uselessly, or all sorts of things, horrible things that can happen, then we are toying with the fixed things that God has put into motion. And we need to think about that. And then in verse 15, he's talking about that which has been already, and that which will be has already been. So this is speaking of the nature of God, that He already knows even the things that have not happened yet. He knows those things already. And it's in God's eyes, it's like those things have already happened too, because He can see the things that will happen, the things that He's already got in place for the future. And I think that's where they end this week. Yeah, they do, is on verse 15. Now the rest of this chapter, which is a few verses, it talks a little bit about man being the same as the beasts, and that they're all going to the same place. Dust returns to dust. And who is it that knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? That's in verse 21. So that again is one of those what I would call rhetorical questions, that obviously the one who knows that is God. And so he's saying it in this poetic form. And also he asks another one right at the end of the chapter where he says, for who will bring him to see what will occur after him? So God is the only one who knows what will occur after we die or after we leave this earth. And so this whole, chapter 3 then is on the discussion of time and how time is so important, and we are stewards of the time that God gives us. And I think that's the most important takeaway that we can think about along these lines, that yes, all of these things happen in their time as God sets things into motion, but we personally have to be stewards of the time that God has given us, because all of us just have 24 hours in our day. And, we should be aware and think often about wasting God's time that He has given us, and how we may be wasting His time that we could be doing something more productive for His kingdom. And I'm pointing the finger at me when I say that, because I could accomplish a lot more than I have if I would be a little bit more focused. And so we can all think about that this week. And then next week we're going to go on and study chapter 4. So I look forward to seeing you next week.